It's a great pleasure to welcome David Ignatius, the award-winning columnist for the Washington Post, here to the Kennedy School. Dave is a fellow with our Future Diplomacy Project this week. David, you've been meeting with students. You gave an important speech on the Middle East this week. And what all of us are interested in asking you about is Brzezinski's arc of crisis. These crises that are rolling through not just the Middle East, but also South Asia, both vital regions for American engagement in the world. How do you appreciate, let's start with South Asia. How do you appreciate this long-lasting, nearly decade-long commitment of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, the difficult relationship with Pakistan? What are the choices the Obama administration is going to have to make in the next year or two to stabilize American interests and policy in the region?
Well, Nick, we've been talking about an arc of crisis stretching across North Africa, the Middle East, to Afghanistan and Pakistan for as long as I've been covering that part of the world. That goes back to 1980, and I remember people talking about the arc of crisis back then. We go from crisis to crisis, but certainly the crisis moved into a new phase with September 11, 2001, which led us to send troops to Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime. And that commitment has morphed and grown so that we now have over 100,000 troops in Pakistan, and we have intense strategic interests and problems both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think one of the issues that the Obama administration is going to have to think about is how to connect better what's happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan with these amazing developments in the last 3 months in North Africa as something genuinely new. I'm somebody who for 3 decades has been visiting and writing about this part of the world, but this is really new. This is a new voice, and I think potentially it offers a way out of a lot of the problems that we've been dealing with. So somehow the administration has to find a way to connect policy in AFPAC, as we call it, with this Arab Spring. We'll talk about that more in our conversation, but that's my starting point.
Right, and this all happens at a time of resource constraints. Really for the first time that I can remember in American foreign policy, where we don't have the option of spending whatever it takes, as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, to be successful. Now we have this budget, the severe budget constraints that the Congress and President are talking about. If we're going to look at American interests anew, where are our vital interests in this entire space, and where are really the important interests? And would you advocate that we shift some of those, the $100 billion spent in Afghanistan every year, say to Egypt?
One of the valuable things about being here at Harvard this week as a Fisher Fellow is that it's given me a chance to step back from my day-to-day work and think a little bit about precisely the question that you're raising. It's a fact that when you have a constrained budget, you're forced to make choices that you might not otherwise make. And the more I've thought about this week, preparing to talk to students here, the more I've thought that the Obama administration really needs to set its priorities. A key strategic priority is helping the Egyptians make their democratic revolution work. If that succeeds, it's really going to change the face of the Arab world. So that's got to be job one. Another job one is Pakistan. Pakistan's a country that is in terrible trouble economically, politically. Somehow we've been getting things wrong there. So the idea that we should spend $100 billion on a war in Afghanistan that, however logical its roots are, first isn't going very well in terms of the broad outlook, and second is costing us more than we can afford relative to other priorities that we have. So I come away from this week at Harvard thinking I need to write a column saying we need to change that mix of spending so that more of our money is going to the things that are job one items, and we just talked about Egypt and Pakistan, and somewhat less. I wouldn't, not for bailing out of Afghanistan completely, but the mix ought to change.
Right, and that's going to necessitate a lot of new thinking in Washington, because President Obama came to office saying the central front in the war on terrorism, if you will, is Afghanistan, not Iraq. But now you have this extraordinary developments in the Arab world, where our vital interests in places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia are directly engaged by the unknowable factor of what's going to happen in the future. So do you see the Obama administration or any government being able to transition quickly, because we don't have a lot of time to make these decisions? Or is that not just possible in a big government like ours?
As you know better than most, having served in government for so long, quick change is not what the U.S. government is about. It does some things well, but that's not one of them. But I think this will be a measure of President Obama's leadership. In terms of the rationale, the President got elected saying, we need to focus on the real threat to America, which is Al-Qaeda, and we need to focus on the war in Afghanistan because that's about stopping Al-Qaeda. Well, I think the President could say, I started with that rightly as my number one priority, but we see now in Egypt and in this Arab Spring of revolution a new way of combating Al-Qaeda, which is not with drone attacks and not with 100,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan, but with a different path that offers people in the Muslim world a different way to express their frustrations, their dreams, their anger. People are expressing it now in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria in a more positive way. They're saying, we want to govern ourselves. We want to write our own history. We want this story to be our story. And you know, that's a more hopeful future, and it's also a pretty good anti-Al-Qaeda strategy. So I think the President could rationalize it to himself that way, that this is what I've always said, here's a new way to do it.
Right. So you gave a very thoughtful speech today to our students and faculty on the Middle East situation. It was very serious, somber, and I thought quite elegant speech. You referred to historical examples of 1848, 1917, others. It seems to me that based on what you said today and based on our own my own observations, that the President faces, President Obama, a highly complex challenge. 22 Arab countries all will have their own type of revolution or transformation. How does he balance competing interests? Where do you intervene? Where do you not intervene? Which countries are vital to us, which are not vital but important? That balancing act is the true test of diplomacy. How's the President doing, do you think, and the United States doing, and what could they do differently, in your view, to be even more successful?
What I said to your students today, Nick, was that I think the President needs to be clear about two things. First, the absolute central importance of the success of the democratic revolution in Egypt.
Right.
This really matters to us and our future, not to say the Egyptians. So we need to find money to help. We need to help them with training a police force that can keep order. We need to help them keep their economy from real trouble later this year. That's the first thing. The second thing the President needs to do is to be clear in this period where you just can't predict where this history we're living through will end up, to be clear about what our interests are. I mean, in times of uncertainty, it's especially important that you hold on tight to conception of national interests. So what are our interests? They're pretty simple. We do have an interest in reliable supply of oil.
Right.
And that means that we have an interest in Saudi stability. So things that threaten Saudi stability right now are not in our national interest. So we need to be clear about that. We have an interest in combating terrorism. Al-Qaeda took down our Twin Towers, our Pentagon. I mean, you know, there are people out there who'd like to kill as many Americans as they could. We have an absolute national interest in combating them, and that requires certain policies and tactics. So that's the second thing. We have an interest in protecting the security of Israel, which is our closest ally in the Middle East. So that's on the list. I also think that we have an interest in helping Israel, pushing Israel to resolve the Palestinian problem for their benefit and for ours. And finally, we have an interest in good governance, in the process of democratic political change. That's a list where you could say, well, there's some conflicting priorities there, but that's what leadership is about. I mean, things don't always go in the same direction. So I think the President and his advisors need to sit down and figure out, how do we make these national interests all fit with a strategy that's going to keep America safe and secure no matter what the outcome is, because we can't predict it.
Would you agree with the thought, based on what you've just said, that one way to describe the challenges of the United States is that we should support democracy where we can, where we think it might be able to succeed, places like Egypt and Tunisia, but we also must protect American interests that are vital, where we must do so, in places like Yemen or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. Is that one way to think about the challenge?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think that we can see that there are constraints on our freedom of action. We should not be a cork tossed on this sea. We do need to be anchored in certain realities. You just mentioned them. I mean, if you have chaos in Yemen, so that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula can plan attacks like the attack last Christmas, where they tried to take down an airliner, we have a big problem. If you have instability that rolls from Bahrain, from the Shiite community in Bahrain, across the causeway into the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, that stops or disrupts the production of oil and sends the price of oil to $250, $300 a barrel, we have a problem. So we just have to operate within those limits, and I do think that doesn't mean that we abandon principle. It means that we have to make principle and interest fit together as part of a coordinated national security strategy.
So some have accused President Obama of being inconsistent. I don't know if we can have a completely consistent policy in the region. They've said, well, he's been very vocal and open about calling for Gaddafi's downfall, but has not been nearly as critical of the Bahraini and Yemeni governments. Do you think it's necessary for the United States to speak more softly in Bahrain and Yemen, given the security interests you've just outlined?
I think that Saudi Arabia has made clear that it regards a change of leadership in Bahrain, the replacement of the royal family there by even an elected Shia-led
constitutional
monarchy
yeah.
is inimical to its interests and unacceptable. Saudi Arabia is our ally, and we have to take that seriously. We might say to the Saudis, we'd prefer another outcome, but this is their next door neighbor. We wouldn't want the Saudis telling us what to do in Mexico, and so that there is a primacy to their view, given that it's their closest neighbor. I do think that President Obama, while I understand and in many ways would applaud his attempt to speak in a low-key way, to let these developments play out so that the Arabs feel at last that they're writing their own history and not accepting dictation from the Americans or outside powers. I understand why he's done it, but I think it is time for him to be more forthright and explicit in stating what our basic interests are. And I start with the things that we just talked about, but I think he needs to say that to the country. I'd love to see him go to the region. I'd love to see him make a Cairo II speech, not to get in the way of the Egyptians, not to kind of monopolize their revolution.
He can't be the orchestra conductor.
He's not the orchestra conductor, but this is a person who raised hopes in the Arab world, around the world. This is a man who was so exciting that, bizarrely, the Norwegians decided to give him the Nobel Peace Prize when he'd been in office for 6 months. I mean, that was a crazy thing to do, but it reflected the enormous sense of optimism that Obama released in the world.
Yes.
It's there, it's real. I think it's time for the president to come back to that and find new ways to express it. Sometimes I think he's being more reticent than he should be. He's a leader the world needs to hear from now.
So with that in mind, a final question. You and I were in Beijing in December of 2010. Most people, journalists, columnists, former diplomats, professors might say China and our security situation in Asia are the most profound American vital interests for the next 50 years. But we're caught up in the immediate crises of South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Middle East. How does the United States balance these short and long-term interests? Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? Is there enough time in the day and sufficient resources and energy for one government to deal with so many crises and challenges at once? I do think it's a very challenging time.
This will test President Obama. It will test his national security team. This is a time when the leadership of his national security team is about to change. So it's an opportunity for him, but also a danger. It'd be tough to come up with a team that's as strong as Bob Gates, Admiral Mullen, Leon
Secretary
Panetta at CIA, Secretary Clinton.
Yeah.
So, but he's going to have a new team. I think I'm struck. This is a time when people talk about the end of American hegemony, the post-American era, as my colleague Fareed Zakaria has said. I'm actually struck by the resilience of American power. I mean, you know, this is a bumpy time for the U.S., but as I look around the world, I don't see a lot of powers really ready to challenge us in any respect, financially, certainly not militarily. And when you see developments in Egypt and the Arab world, this what I call political awakening taking place and spreading, it'll spread to China. I mean, there's just no way that you're going to be able to hold this back indefinitely. I think that we're going to end up with a 21st century that is heading more in a direction that's favorable to American interests than people might think.
David, thank you very much. Thank you for being at Harvard this week, for being a Fisher Fellow in our Future Diplomacy Project, and thanks for your thoughts today.
Thank you, Nick.